All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Philosophy of Freedom book study. Today, we're going to be covering Chapter 3, Thinking in the Service of Knowledge. And Matt is going to be giving us our summary today, so I will hand it over to him.
Thanks, Ashton. Good to see everyone. I'm glad 3 sessions in that we've still got the full group. Even I think we're growing a little bit. That's fantastic. So I'm going to try to quickly offer some reflections on chapter 3, Thinking in the Service of Knowledge. I'm going to go quickly because I want to leave us the maximal time to discuss. And my goal is just to sort of set out a buffet of ideas, both to summarize what I think the key points are and offer some potential responses to issues that might arise for some of us as we read what Steiner is saying. The first thing is this example he starts out with the billiard balls, classic example in the history of philosophy. David Hume makes the point that when we observe, sticking purely to what we observe, one billiard ball hitting another, that in the observation itself, there's no causation, there's no necessary connection, and that this is a concept that we add later. Steiner's building on this example, and I think it's important for us not to get too hung up on the example that he chooses, because it's kind of accidental or incidental to the point he's really trying to make in this chapter, which concerns the difference in the observation of our own thinking from the observation of any other object in the world. But anyone who has schooled themselves in some of the tangle of concepts associated with quantum physics might immediately have thought of the double slit experiment and the case of photons, which, unlike billiard balls, in the example Steiner uses, are apparently affected by our observation. Now, I think if you did have this thought come up, I want to say that it's, I understand that connection, but that it's not really relevant. Why? Well, because first of all, we're talking about, with the double slit experiment, a measurement by an apparatus in an experimental setup. And we're not talking about sense observation in the common sense way that Steiner tells us he's trying to speak in this book. In an experimental setup, we've already, as it were, posed a question to nature. We've already engaged in perceptual experience by inserting thinking to create this artificial setup whereby we could see how, when you do try to measure which slit the photon goes through, you end up changing whether it appears initially synchronically, as it were, as a waveform on the detecting surface, or as a single particle, though diachronically, if you observe which slit it goes through, it will appear initially as hitting one point, but over time it recreates the same wave pattern. Anyways, that's not important. The point here is that it's not in any way refuting Steiner's point about our thinking activity not being involved in how the billiard balls affect one another, because an experimental setup already presupposes all sorts of thinking mixed in with what the observed natural world would be doing. And the other thing is, measurement is not the same as sense perception. Measurement is a technological extension, you might say, of sense observation. But as Goethe reminds us, we have to be very careful with such technological extensions because it throws everything out of proportion. And that the human being, the healthy human being with its sensory organs, is the best measuring device, if you want, that we could ask for when it comes to understanding nature, right? So maybe this example of quantum physics didn't come up for you at all when you thought of the billiard balls, but it did come up for me, and I wanted to just head it off at the pass, as it were. Now, there's another issue that could come up when Steiner is describing the data of perception or the data of observation as not including any interconnections, and that we just observe a bare object initially without any sense of how it might relate to other objects. I'm hearing an echo. Is someone's mic not muted? Okay, it's gone now. From the philosophical tradition out of which Steiner is writing, and in the common sense way in which he's trying to speak, I think that's perfectly accurate. But if you were coming out of, say, a radical empiricist rather than a classical empiricist philosophical lineage, I'm thinking of William James, Alfred North Whitehead, you might question this and say, well, no, the data of perception actually do include interconnections, and that to even discriminate an object in the field of perception is already to presuppose its relationship to all the other objects. Again, I think Steiner's chosen an example and he's speaking in common sense terms. And I had to catch myself trying to run down this train of thought, wondering if it's really accurate to say that one could isolate, or that one's initial observation of the sensory world came in the form of isolated objects or isolated qualities. I think we can question that, but it's kind of incidental to the point Steiner's trying to make. And the key point in this whole chapter is the exceptional state, right? The sense in which our observation of anything in the outside world is quite different from our observation of our own thinking. And why is that? Well, because when we are observing our own thinking, we're observing it with our thinking. And as such, we are directly, immediately, intimately aware of having created our own thinking. Now, Steiner admits that it's this curious fact that we can actually only observe our past thinking, but nonetheless, there's a kind of what the philosophical tradition he's coming out of would call an intellectual intuition, whereby we know that the past thinking we're observing is our own thinking, and we've irradiated that past thinking, as it were, with our own consciousness to such an extent that we know exactly how we have created it. But he says that this awareness of our own thinking is an awareness of the just past thinking by a fresh thinking, right? And that this temporicity, if you want, in our thinking is something that somehow even the creator is subject to. He points out in the book of Genesis how, the first 6 days, God is creating the, different aspects of the world and all the plants and animals and so on. And on the seventh day contemplates it and says, it is good, right? So that this structure of our thinking activity is not just about human beings, but it also applies even to the creator. But nonetheless, and he then talks about Descartes in the famous statement that I think, therefore I am, and points out how, again, in our own thinking, because we're intimately aware of the creative activity that we're engaged in when we direct our observation to our thinking itself, it grants us a sense of our own existence. We don't have that same intimate sense of existence, self-existence, as it were, when we are aware of objects in our perceptual field, but we unknowingly grant, if we do grant existence to objects in our perceptual field, sort of by derivation from our sense of our own existence. And so thinking in this way becomes, for Steiner, the Archimedean point from which all knowledge of the world must stem, the point upon which and all our knowledge of the world must be balanced. And then here he brings up a possible objection that people might raise and say, well, doesn't thinking presuppose consciousness? And his point here is that consciousness is simply the vehicle of our thinking. And if we really want to understand what consciousness is, of course, we're going to need to think about it, right? And so he makes a point here that, the creator of the world might be concerned with this issue of the priority of consciousness or thinking, but that the philosopher is not concerned with creating the world, but with understanding it. And consciousness is something given, right? And if we're going to understand consciousness or anything else that's given in our experience of the world, we must first determine whether our thinking is trustworthy, whether it's trustworthy enough to examine anything else that we might observe. And this whole distinction between subject and object, he points out, is a distinction made by thinking. Subject and object are concepts produced by thinking, right? And then he makes this remark that, similar to the comment that the philosopher is not concerned with creating the world, but with understanding it. He says, man is not the first link in the chain of creation, but the last. And he talks about this difference of trying to understand the world from where we are in our experience of a world as given versus trying to understand the world as if we were its creator. And here I immediately thought of the difference between Hegel and Schelling, and this will be the final point I'll make. It's a distinction that Schelling himself makes about a decade after Hegel dies in his late lectures. Actually, I have the book here, The Grounding of Positive Philosophy in Berlin in the 1840s. And he makes this distinction between negative and positive philosophy, where negative philosophy would be this attempt, as Steiner describes it, to understand the world in its origin, as if we were God before the creation of the existing world, trying to understand the a priori categories that formed the principles upon which that world would be created. Steiner says that this approach is kind of like leaves us with just ideas hanging in the air, right? Positive philosophy then would be starting with our present existence, starting with our actual experience and becoming aware of our own thinking as something a posteriori, if you want to use that term, as opposed to a priori, in the sense that our thinking is what the world evolution, the process of the world's evolution has arrived at. It's the last thing, right? And so we have to start from where we are, and then we can look back, to understand the origin, as he gives the example of geology, understand the present conditions of the earth, and then in order to step back to better understand its history. So I think Steiner's trying to engage us in this activity of positive philosophy, beginning with our actual existential experience, as it were, rather than what Hegel tried to do with his logic, is to understand the origin of the world in these a priori concepts. Not that that couldn't be a valuable exercise, but ultimately, to fully understand our situation as thinking beings, we have to engage in what Schelling called positive philosophy. And then there's this little aside at the end, added in 1918, where he's responding to an objection that really, our own thinking is just an excretion of this unconscious process, and we think that we're responsible for our own thinking, but actually it's just this unconscious, whether physiological process or unconscious psychological process going on, and it's an illusion ultimately. But Steiner points out that even in claiming that this is an illusion, you've already presupposed the trustworthiness of your own thinking in the very claim, right? That's enough for me. I'm going to stop there. And wow, 23 comments in the chat already. Ashton, are you going to facilitate the exchange?
Sure. Yeah, I was trying to keep up as well as you were speaking with the chat. And, nobody's hand is up yet. So I wanted to maybe invite Lorenzo. Would you like to share what you initially shared? I think that kind of sparked the conversation. And I just wanted to say that as far as I understood you, I would characterize what Steiner is describing as the exceptional state in the way that you did, sort of like this conscious participation in the thinking that's always already going on in our observation. But anyway, I want to hear what you had to say about that.
Thanks. yeah, it was just a small observation regarding what Matt said about the fact that we can only observe past thinking, but I think that's not a case of an exceptional state, because when we observe our past thinking, that's another object, and so we are still living out the actual thinking that's been done at the moment. So it wouldn't be a case of not living out something. The only real exceptional state, I think, is when we observe our present thinking. Then there was an observation that it said we don't really observe our present thinking. We can only observe what we have just thought. But I think that doesn't count as past thinking. That's just retention, because if we take for granted that thinking already is in itself diachronic, and it always has a pretension and a retention of what has just been thought, and a protension towards what is going to be thought. And if we take that whole, let's say, machinery as the actual thinking that's doing the observation, then even if when we observe our actual thinking, we're actually observing what we just thought, well, I think that's the thinking that's doing the observation. So it counts as present thinking. And I think that, yeah, the exceptional state is only when we observe the thinking that's going on at the very moment, not because, and by the way, I would like to add something. I don't think that we can really think about, really observe past thinking, because when we remember something, we are actually recreating it, and we are actually so creating a new thought that we relate to the one that's been already done. So I would turn the argument on its head and say that we actually cannot ever observe past thinking. We can only observe actual thinking, and that's the exceptional state, in my opinion.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Yeah, Max mentioned in the chat that making distinctions, when we're talking about different kinds of observation, is going to be really important here. So I'd love to eventually hear more from Max about that. And I just also wanted to mention, as you were speaking, Lorenzo, I was thinking of that moment in the chapter when Steiner makes this distinction, and he's talking about the exceptional state between the experience of this is a table, when you're like looking at a table, this is a table. And so the thought is already sort of unconsciously there in the observation of the table, versus looking at the table, I am thinking the table, so that's sort of part of the observation. Anyway, what are you thinking, Jonathan?
Yes, directly in response to what Lorenzo's bringing up, and it may just be the different ways we kind of frame it in words and so forth, but the way I'm getting it is that how else are we aware of our thoughts except that there's an observation going on? It's not the observation we use for billiard balls and so forth, but so one might say that when one's thinking about thinking, there's a component of observation in the thinking. And that's my understanding of the exceptional state, is that the observation and the thinking are one. Nevertheless, because time is a factor, so that then you can give pride of place to one of those two, and it necessarily has to be observation, because we are conscious beings, so we need to be conscious of the thinking. But again, it may just be sort of how we're approaching it, how we're couching it in language. But yes, I'd be interested to hear Max talking about defining the terms and so forth, whatever he wants to say. If he wants to say anything, I'll shut up now.
Thanks, Jonathan. I've actually been rereading Saving the Appearances at the same time as I was reading this chapter, and I feel like Barfield actually uses language, different terms that makes it almost helpful in making these distinctions that maybe are kind of causing some misunderstanding between us. But and maybe that's partially, one of the reasons why this alternative title of the philosophy of spiritual activity, Steiner thought might be helpful, because I think one way of talking about this, the observed or thinking observation or thoughtful observation, you could think of Goethe and his method of empiricism, but also Barfield talks about participation. And so I think this is a kind of like attempt to induce the experience or conscious participation in the reader. But Josh, what are you thinking?
Actually, some of the same types of things that Jonathan already mentioned. So I guess I'll just add that especially this addition at the end from 1918 kind of made me remember William James's essay about how consciousness is not an entity. And at first that sounds really counterintuitive, to think that there's not like some kind of seat to consciousness that we can sort of distinguish in our own brains, but it makes sense really in the Whiteheadian paradigm of a process consciousness. Obviously Whitehead was really influenced by that, but by James. But anyway, the point is the only addition I would say is that that's been really helpful for me to realize that act or that process of thinking is really the culmination of this giant nexus of occasions that has everything to do with what we call the external world in complete and absolute continuous flow with our perceptions and our awareness of it. And interestingly, Jonathan did mention that time factor too, because there's a certain amount of time, I guess, that quote unquote passes between a photon bouncing off of a leaf of a tree and entering into our retina, and and that whole flow of process. But the point is that there really is no separation between actual separation between a quote unquote external world and our internal consciousness. It's really continuous in some senses, and it's the same type of ultimately issue of that problem of the one and the many, so to speak. I won't get into that, but it relates to that. So anyway, that just reminded me of James's essay, which has been helpful to me to sort of understand this concept I think Steiner is trying to get at.
Thanks, Josh. It just made me think about that moment in the chapter where I think he's emphasizing throughout the chapter this self-activity, of the experience of thinking, as sort of arising from this end. But he said he brackets the question as to, like, I don't know, I guess the thinking that is, creating the subject and the object, and what you described just made me think about that larger flowing. But Carol, what are you thinking?
Hi, thank you, Ashton. So I'm coming at it from a little bit of a different angle. I really flowed with Steiner in chapter 2, but when I got to chapter 3, all I could think of was Ian McGilchrist's magnificent tome, 3,000-page tome, The Matter with Things. Okay, granted, I've only read about 600 pages so far, but in that he really talks about left hemisphere thinking and right hemisphere thinking, and how in the West increasingly we've cultivated left hemisphere thinking, which sees things in snippets. There is no time in the sense of duration. There is only what do you call those, whatever, quick frame, what do you call those little frames, technology speaking, anyway, the little individual frames of a view of when we do observe. And Max, for your sake, thank you for asking. I would say that observation begins with attending to something. So there's an intention there to attend to something. So we're aiming our conscious awareness at something. And I'm guessing you'll respond fully with your version. And so the other thing I thought of is that, so when McGilchrist says in the left brain, we're seeing snippets of things when we perceive, he says in the right brain, it's a whole different experience. It's more of actually in touch with reality, which reminds me of Goethe's way of perceiving nature. But also, as I've listened to the discussion, I thought of, especially Lorenzo, as you brought up the issue of time, the left brain, right brain issue, or left hemisphere, right hemisphere issue, reminds me of Bergson's a little tiny book on metaphysics, in which he seems also to be aware of these two ways of seeing reality, in which there is the way that sees duration. And my whole experience of what I've read so far of chapter 3 is that Steiner is talking, in my opinion, I could be mistaken, about a left brain way of seeing snippets of reality. When I was typing in the chat about the observer mind, I don't think we can park it in left or right hemisphere, because in some sense it's transcendental. So that kind of observation is just to attend to awareness itself. It's not the same as tending to thinking. Steiner is talking about attending to our thinking, which he posits as a past experience. Yes, in the pure observer mind, if we can get there in a meditative state, or better yet, live that way, it's pure awareness on an ongoing basis, and duration is part of the process. The other thing I wanted to bring up is, Matt, it was some class you taught that I took with you. You had us read, I think it was Hume, with that lack of causation and things. That's the other thing this chapter reminded me of. And again, to me, after reading some of McGilchrist, it's that left brain approach that can make the connections between the observations. But the right brain seems to have that ongoing sense of the connections of the billiard ball hits the other billiard ball and keeps going. So to me, I'm wondering if we're missing something by not looking at these two fundamentally different brain ways of seeing things.
Thanks, Carol. Good question. Max, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hope everyone can hear me. I'd like to just pick up on the one of the first points that that was raised, I think, by Lorenzo, about the question of observation, and I indicated that I think it's going to be critical to be very clear about how we're using these words, and also understand that everything, I think, as a rule, most of us are reading English translations of this text, which, as everyone knows, was written in German, and we should be open to the idea that while the translation is possible, that it's never going to be like, translation is not the same thing as like a perfect facsimile, and so we always have to consider that Steiner might have been using words in ways that are not the familiar ways that we would use them. And I think, he says that specifically about the title of the book, Philosophy of Freedom. I think that relates to a point that Ashton brought up, which is like the idea of self-activity, and freedom not as like liberation from external constraints, but rather freedom as like a conscious participation in our will, basically, our activity. And I think, and that's, I guess I'll use that as a segue to at least parse at least two different ways that I understand observation can be used, and with the caveat that there are probably many more. And I like, if anyone wants to contribute here, I'd be interested to hear that. But I think the first way that people think about observation is through the kind of implying the structure of sensory observation, which implies in a certain way the subject-object polarity, the subject-object structure of perception. And so in that context, it's not really coherent to say that you can make an observation you can make an observation without implying an object that's separate from you, or that's separate from the subject making the observation. And I think Steiner's in this chapter, Steiner is, and so then I guess the point that I would make is, as long as you're trying to observe thinking, you in the present moment, strictly speaking, it hasn't like the thinking in the present moment doesn't actually exist yet, because the thinking is still in the form of, a will or an intention to think. And I know that sounds confusing, but I think like an analogy could make it clearer. It's not possible for anyone, for instance, to observe what I have said until I've finished saying it. You see what I mean? Even myself, like before I've spoken, all I have is this sort of inchoate will or intention to express something, but the thing doesn't exist yet, as an object that can be observed until I've finished expressing it in this case. And I think Steiner's pointing to, when he says that the thinking we observe will always be past, I think he's pointing to that fact, which is that until something is rendered explicit, it can't become an object of observation. Another way to, though, interpret observation would be just like very broadly construed and think of it as anything that you could become aware of in any context. And I think that's actually what Steiner is drawing us to in this chapter, inviting us to start to consider, is that in spite of the fact that I, for instance, can't observe what I have said until I finish saying it, nevertheless, I can begin to use the word that Ashton brought in, to participate. And that's more just like, so for instance, I can observe my hand being raised. That's one way of like learning about the hand being raised. But I could also do it from the other side, which is to become conscious in the intention to raise the hand. And that's actually like the power, actually, that the power of the will that is responsible for the hand being raised, which I can then later like a posteriori perceive as a in the subject object structure. And so I think what Steiner is increasingly inviting us to do is actually like to become aware of that will or the intention that is the sort of like the engine or the fire that kindles our thinking into activity. And so I guess that's probably a good place to stop. I do just want to invite also, at least suggest something. I know this chapter, the idea of the exceptional state is an important point in this chapter. To me, the most, at least when I read this, the most exciting point that Steiner makes is not per se about the exceptional state, but when he says about the way we conceptualize subject and object. I'll just read the passage. He says, "For in subject and object, we already have concepts that are formed through thinking." And this, I think he elaborates on in the next chapter, when he says, I should never say that my individual subject thinks, rather it lives by grace of thinking. Thus, thinking is an element that leaves me beyond myself and unites me with the objects. And so I guess this I would just relate again to what the word that Ashton used, participation. In thinking, we through the observation of thinking and through the experience of thinking, we can start to discover the fact that in our thinking, we're actually taking part in this sort of almost structure of objective reason, which in other contexts is called something like logos. And so I think Steiner is also trying to introduce us to the experience of logos. So I'll stop there, and I'd be interested to hear what anyone wants to pick up on.
Thank you, Max. When Matt and I were talking earlier this morning, I just shared this quote that from one of Barfield's essays. It's either of the consciousness soul or of the intellectual soul. And I think he's quoting Steiner, describing anthroposophy as the intellectual soul speaking to the consciousness soul. And it just reminded me, that's a little bit in the weeds, but as you were describing, Max, that wonderful quotation about, the subject, being constituted, by the grace of thinking, and being sort of invited to participate in the logos again is sort of how I understand what Barfield means by that, or I guess what Steiner meant if it was Steiner who said that. But anyway, David, what are you thinking?
So with the subject, object, observer, observed divide, just bringing in a really simple thing. If you have, it's called the EPR paradox. I'm sure people know about it. And it's just, if you have two particles with sum of spin 0 and you break them apart and separate them arbitrary distances, And even if you move around the measuring apparatus, when you measure one, the other one will be such that their spin is summed to 0 still. So in that sense, even though in space-time, these two things are super far away and seem like they're different things, they're actually still one thing. And that kind of permeates all of space-time energy, everything. So in that sense, our thinking about it is also, it's the same, it's one total movement, and the thinking is part of that movement. Observing the thinking is just getting another like layer back of looking at the same movement. And I don't know if thinking can penetrate arbitrarily deep into like, it's like an onion and just like, I don't know how deep like thinking can go, but I'm excited to see where he goes with this and how he develops it. I'm assuming what's meant by observing thinking is proprioception of thought in other language, like seeing what thinking is actually doing. And that's something I was trying to do last summer before summer ended. And it did feel amazing. I was like walking through Mont Royal down the street and just like trying to observe every tiny thing that was happening. And it felt wonderful. It felt like, yeah, anyways, but so yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thanks for sharing, David. I think as I understand what you were describing, the spin, the spooky action at a distance or non-locality, or I don't know if I'm characterizing it correctly, but those seem like important, I guess. I don't know if you'd call them observations, but I guess not irrelevant to a holistic picture of the universe or the cosmos that I think Steiner's trying to help people return to. Alex, what are you thinking?
Yeah, hi, everyone. Yeah, I was reflecting a little bit on the ways in which I kind of feel that I observe my own thinking and just trying to see how that could be a contribution to this discussion. I mean, one way is, I think some of you have spoken about, is in meditation or mindfulness practice, in which you can sort of observe the contents or the activity of your mind. But there I feel that at least for me, it tends to go a little bit to this realm that Steiner speaks about, that it's more sort of dreamy, automatic, reflections of feelings that are coming up. So it's not that free creative thinking that Steiner speaks about, but still a way to observe your own thought contents or contents of your mind. Another way would be maybe the one that I'm doing now, which is I'm reflecting upon or hearing myself just what I said in terms of moving my reflections or thought process forward in order to have this discussion with you. And yeah, without not trying to be too philosophical with if I am observing my thinking in the present or just the immediate past, but that is another way that I feel I can observe my thinking. But the one that I felt that I really wanted to share with you, and it is a bit from my own studies of anthroposophy and Goetheanism, and very much inspired. I don't know if any one of you knows this book, but it's Nigel Hoffman, and he has a book called Goethe's Science of Living Form, The Artistic Stages, in which in this book, he very much speaks about and shows how physical thinking and imagination, inspiration, and intuition are different modes of thinking. And what what was special for me when reading this book and doing some exercising and doing these studies is that I could see in my mind where physical thinking is sort of appearing, and how physical thinking is a mode of thinking different from imagination, which is for me a different mode or type of thinking. And it was not so much about, the observing was not so much about observing the contents of my thinking, but it felt for me a deeper layer. It was how my thinking is conceiving the world. So, and I don't know if that, I mean, not to say what the exceptional state is, but to me that was a different a different way of thinking about thinking from the other ones, the other two that I mentioned, that felt more creative, going into that state of freeing my thinking and being more creative in the world.
Thanks, Alex. That sounds like a great book. Yeah, I mean, as I was hearing you describe those distinctions, I just thought of, especially that thinking of that is imagination as that kind of creative participation in the formative activity. But anyway, Matt, what are you thinking?
A lot. I think Max's point about the translation is very important, not only because Steiner wrote this in German and we're reading it in English, but even if he did write it in English, one can choose many different words to try to express the same ideas. And so we can't get too hung up on the words. The choice of words is important, and I think Steiner is choosing his words as carefully as he can, but nonetheless, especially a century later in a different cultural context, it might be that some of what for him was carefully chosen, for us, time and word usage that we're more used to can interfere. Thinking as a word, I think in our contemporary spiritual milieu can end up indicating something that is not at all what he was trying to direct our attention to. For example, when we think of meditation, it's often imagined that the goal of at least some forms of meditation would be to eliminate thought, right? To turn off the thought process, and so as to just be aware of what is arising. When Steiner is talking about this kind of intuitive thinking activity, it is a form of meditative thinking. And I think his point would be that even if you are meditating in the way that some schools of thought, like Vipassana meditations, I would direct you to just attend to your breath, stop attaching to the thoughts that are arising. Steiner would say, well, there's still thinking activity going on there. It's just a different mode of thinking activity than the kind of monkey mind, maybe verbal form of thought that we're typically engaged in when we're actually not observing our thinking in the way that he's trying to get us to. We're observing our feelings or our emotions or our sympathies and antipathies and so on. So when we hear thinking, don't think some abstract intellectual exercise. He's pointing to a deep, intimate sense of really our own self-creation from moment to moment. And so I would interpret it. And then in regards to Lorenzo, your points earlier and what I was saying about only being able to, we can't catch ourselves in the act of thinking in a way, because thinking is not a fact to be observed. It is an activity, right? And I think, Steiner, at least in my copy on 34 and 35, is pretty explicit about this. He says, after describing how there's a difference between contemplation and creation. He says, I am in the same position when I enter into the exceptional state and reflect on my own thinking. I can never observe my present thinking. I can only subsequently take my experience of my thinking process as the object of fresh thinking. Now, I take everything that you were saying, Lorenzo, about past thinking being a memory, and that we can't observe it as thinking as such, if it's in the past, because we're always engaged in thinking in the present as we do so. Here, I would point to a Whiteheadian insight, which was helpful for me here, that Whitehead says that immanent in our own present process of thinking, there is an intuition not only of the just past moment. You used the phenomenological term retention. Whitehead would say that in the stream of consciousness that constitutes my own most intimate sense of myself, I'm inheriting moment by moment the just past thought, and it's actually not a separate entity just in the past somewhere else, but it's really bleeding into the present. And similarly, I have an intuition in my present activity of thinking of the transcendent future. This is where will comes into play. And his comment, Steiner's comment at the end about willing and thinking, willing, and Leif, Max, your comment about the inchoate origination of thinking as an act of will. Whitehead would say we have immanent in the present activity of our own thinking an intuition of its future consequence transcendent to this moment. And so I would say the exceptional state is an awareness of the transitional character of thinking, right? It's sort of the tension, it's an awareness of the tension between past and future. It's not a simple present, like an instant cut off from past and future. It's an awareness of, the transitional character of thinking activity. So it's very hard to describe the exceptional state, but hopefully I've clarified what I was trying to say, and we can move the ball forward.
Thank you, Matt. Welcome, Captain Frodo. Nice to see you live.
Hello, hi. How are you all? Lovely to be here after all this time. I was. It's very interesting all this time talk about time here. I loved what that Carol brought in, both McGilchrist and also brought in Bergson, who has talked interesting about time and the flow. But my thoughts when I was reading this chapter was based on the importance that thinking plays for Steiner as the Archimedean lever to move the whole world. Has also, like Alex was thinking before as well, on what are the different techniques and what is it that we are looking for when we are looking to learn about thinking. Because there's a couple of times in the chapter where Steiner, he talks about thinking and he says, and we can see thinking and we know thinking because we created ourselves. But when we're sitting, if we're doing meditations and you have this ridiculous random stuff that keeps coming up when you're sitting and trying to calm your mind, the monkey mind, I don't know if that's the kind of thinking that we are meant to observe. And maybe we are after something more like what Alex was talking about with this, the kind of thinking that you have in imagination. And I do a lot of writing, both fiction and nonfiction. And I was thinking, when I'm writing, a lot of the time I have, like Alex was describing, I have this general idea of what I want to talk about. And I think Max as well talked about this. You have this idea of what I want to write or a scene that you want to do. And then I often you just have to write the first draft. And in reading the first draft afterwards, which is my thoughts in the moment, it's like a conversation in a way with yourself. When I then read that again, then I am, in a sense, observing my own thinking and how well I put across the vague ideas that I thought that I had. So that was one sort of, it's not an exercise or whatever, but I guess it could be used as such. And the other thing is that I sometimes think that I do the best thinking, or that I have great ideas, as I hear myself saying them within the conversation. Things that I hadn't put together myself, and that feels like it's a page full of notes that I know it's connected, but when I have to express myself, put on the spot in a conversation, and they say just the right things, sometimes then as well, a great thought comes forth. And this makes me think of some when I lived at a Camp Hill back in the mid-90s or so. We did this project or whatever based on some Swedish text, I think, on Goethean conversation. The idea of having a conversation where you don't try to take over the conversation, but you are kind of having a seed which everybody is talking about, and that you're bringing that forth and keeping it in your mind, and that everyone is trying to make this one idea, that whether it emerges or we have something that we're talking about. So those were kind of three approaches for me for trying to answer this question of how do we understand our thinking, because if we understand thinking, then we will have that lever to kind of understand the world. So there's been some talk, Angus and has talked about this on both on the exceptional state and on here as well, of the 6 exercises as well, and maybe someone has more the basic exercises has more ideas about some of the direct stuff that Steiner said. But anyway, that was what I wanted to share.
Thank you. Frodo, Captain Frodo?
Just Frodo. It's
Just
from
Frodo.
Zoom. During the pandemic, I did some shows, so it's my artist name, but Frodo is my first name.
Okay, cool. Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking of the concentration exercise that, part of the 6 exercises, and how, when you will for like 5 minutes or however long to focus on that object, and it like holding that, as you were describing, like in the conversation or the intention to write about something, it's just comes and comes and comes. Anyway, Rory, what are you thinking about?
Hi everyone. Good. I thought I'd better talk after being quiet for so long. Actually, Ashton, so there are a couple of things that struck me. These are slightly disjointed. First of all, Carol, I was very. First, all I'd say, I suppose, is that I've had the experience of reading this book as, a kind of a dead text, and which kind of I was reminded of, maybe wrongly or rightly or wrongly, but in your comments about the left brain, and I suppose the whole exercise here, at least for me anyway, is to make it a more living thing, which it did, and the kind of the real entering into the kind of phenomenology of consciousness does, I think, really begin with this chapter to a great extent. Ashton, I was just about to say, when you mentioned Barfield, the thing that most reminded me of him, and it's just all those early chapters of Saving the Appearances are very, very, obviously they're based on this book to a great extent, but just the thing that really reminded me of him is that thing about, I'll listen, I'll read the passage. I would like to still to mention a widespread error prevailing with respect to thinking. I'm using a different edition now. It consists in the statement that thinking, as it is in itself, is nowhere given us. The thinking which joins the observations we make of our experiences and interweaves them with a web of concepts is said to be not at all the same as that thinking which we afterwards lift out of the objects of observation again and make the object of our study. And then he says, it is the same type of thinking, basically. And listen, I'm kind of trying to learn here. That reminded me of him, because I think that the thinking embedded in our experience, basically, that's what Barfield is really trying to get at in that passage, and it's where it kind of comes from there, as far as I can tell, which was, and then don't want to be an idiot here, and then that. I'll leave it at that. That's very much.
Thanks, Rory. Yeah, in that particular passage from the chapter 3 that you shared, I was thinking of Barfield as well, and just how, that Steiner was sort of the distinction between participatory, the thinking that we associate with participation versus that, the notion that all of our thoughts are just extracted from what we perceive through the senses. Angus, what are you thinking?
A thousand different things. I was going to riff a little bit on what Matt was saying. It's like the words are only evidence of concepts. Concepts is something completely different. But then Alex came along, and then Frodo came along, and I realized, no, it's conversation that I want to talk about. It's one exercise you can do. I did this at the sauna last week, which is in Sweden. So there's a link there, Alex, and a link there, Frodo, because I've been processing this chapter. And if you haven't developed like the mental alertness, or it's like it's a strength, a mental strength to actually to be able to dig back in your own memories about the memory processes that happen when you go out for a walk, when you're writing. When you're writing, you've got evidence of what you're thinking. But many times during the day, it's like we have these thought trains that run through our head, and they change track, and they change track, and they change track, and they change track. And 20 minutes later, unless you ask yourself the question, how did I get here? Then it's all one great big mystery. But that's a demanding job, and it can be done, and especially if people have done Steiner's 6 exercises, it becomes easier. If you meditate, it becomes easier. But there's an easier way in, and it can go a little bit like this. You sit in a sauna full of loads of old men, like I do every Saturday morning, and you listen to the conversations, and you hear what people talk about, and you, rather than participating like you were describing, Frodo, rather than trying to add to the conversation, you just observe the flow of the conversation, and you see all of that as an expression of what's going on in this group of people. And then obviously you've got different sections of the sauna. So these guys, they're talking about this, and these guys, they're talking about this, and these guys, they're talking about this. But what you're actually doing there is doing exactly what Steiner is telling you you're doing in the exceptional state, which is taking that position outside your own thinking. You're no longer involved in that active process. This idea, I do subscribe to what Steiner's saying here, is that you observe the effects of thinking, or so that you can't observe active thinking. It's there in memory, it's there to be recalled. But any chance that we can get to step out of ourselves to observe our own thinking or others people's thinking without this judgmental attitude, but trying to feel the process that is going on, we see these creative acts that Alex was referring to as well going on the whole time, and they're being used for different purposes. That some people, you'll see them scrabbling around to try to understand something they can't understand. Other people, they're doing it just for the joy of talking about what it is they're talking about. So they're using their thinking to bring to life their passions, and they exchange information. Other people use it just as it's in a Bohemian sense, which is a dialogue discovery. There's no actual definite purpose in the conversation, but nevertheless there feels like there's a central theme there, more investigative, around a topic. And I think all of these types of activities, they start to bring us a little bit closer to this region of the soul that Steiner's talked to us several times about. This source of this infinite source. I was reading the introduction to the Upanishads again today, And there's a lovely phrase in there. It said, we as finite beings can only ever find freedom in the infinite. And when you begin to dig into the exceptional state can be trivial in the sense of I am thinking about a table, but it can also be something completely transcendental when you try to ask yourself the question, what is the origin of my thinking? Because you never get there, you only ever see the effects. Or it's the effects also what is given to you, which you can then observe yourself. And as if you dig deeper into this exceptional state, my own personal experience is an increasing feeling of this infinite being that, as Max said, it's like I live by the grace of thinking, which comes in chapter 4. That can become, and rather than a concept that you can play with and you can agree with and disagree with, it becomes a personal experience. There is something infinite living in me, and it lives through my thinking.
Thanks, Angus. Well, we've reached noon, at least Pacific time, so I think it's a good time to stop here. Thanks, everybody. That was a great conversation. We're looking forward to next week, chapter 4. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.